Hello and welcome to the fourth session in our One Another series. We hope that so far it's been helpful. We hope that at least maybe some of these things you've been able to put into practice over time. Hopefully more of these things as a church we'll be able to grow in. This week we're talking about working for others' good, and that means putting other people first. And on Sunday we looked at Romans 10:12.
It says, "For there is no difference between Jew and Gentile. The same Lord is Lord of all, and richly blesses all who call on him."
And so what we want to tease out a little bit during this time is how to apply that, so we learned about that truth, we're going to look how to kind of apply more of that truth. And so we're going to have some teaching and conversation around expectations, especially in expectations in relationships. What does it mean to devote ourselves to each other, to devote ourselves to somebody else? Sometimes, maybe more often than we like, it probably feels like a sacrifice. But if it's something that is a good sacrifice, and it might be something that's worth it, it's definitely something that's pleasing to God, and definitely requires generosity from us.
Yeah, and generosity is when we are devoting ourselves to someone else, to honor them above ourselves, to share with others, to I suppose sacrifice. That will be a sacrifice for us because it will take our time, it will take our energy, it will take some emotional capacity to listen, to relate to someone, to communicate. But when we are generous with ourselves, when we come to church and we are community, we are family, we take on other people's burdens and we're working for their good, we're looking to serve them and listen to them, we're not the only one giving out. Actually, part of generosity within a generosity kind of culture is that other people will hopefully be doing that back. Church isn't just where we come and consume, we also come and serve and give. So actually what this looks like is a generous community is shaped, is formed, and we do have to give of ourselves. That will hurt a little bit but we also do need to think about, I suppose, our capacity, our resources. We're not trying to be generous in a way that actually God hasn't gifted us in or hasn't given us skills in. Think about what do I have to give, and give with that capacity, give with that resources. Otherwise, if we give out of something that God hasn't given us, we will burn out. It will be an element of us trying to work ourselves into other people's goodness, and that will leave us flat. But if we are giving out of who God has made us to be, and the capacity and the gifts and the resources and the things that God has equipped us with, that will be a fulfilling and life-giving thing. And so it won't burn us out, but it will help us thrive as we help other people thrive. And vice versa, they can use their gifts and their skills and their capacity to help me where I lack, because I can't do those things. And that's uncomfortable and it's difficult to navigate, but it is something that is really helps us flourish if we are generous, just as others are generous towards us.
I think everybody wants to be seen as generous. Maybe everybody thinks themselves as generous, but they are not. But everybody wants to be generous, but nobody wants to sacrifice. And there is no generosity without sacrifice. It's kind of part of what it means, which is why those things go hand in hand. So we'll be talking about both of those things at the same time and in the same kind of way. But this is a pleasing thing for God. In Hebrews 13:16, we read, "And do not forget to do good and to share with others." That sounds great. And then it says, for with such sacrifices God is pleased. So there's an assumption here that doing good and sharing with others is a sacrifice, but it's one that's pleasing to God. If it's something that's pleasing to God, it will always be good for us. There will be never a situation where something that's pleasing to God and not good for us. Now, we may not feel good immediately, but that's just because we're kind of selfish and not really generous by nature. So what is always pleasing to God will always be the best for us. Now, what we want to do, though, is navigate between two lanes. One is the burnout thing that Liz talked about. If we're always giving of only ourselves, then we'll run flat. We don't want to burn out. We also don't want it to be on the other side where we just have like a few blips of generosity. of like, oh, I was generous that one time in 1972. Wasn't that nice? So between burnout and blips runs the path of biblical integrity, the path of biblical generosity. And this is what Jesus is calling us to. He's not calling us to burnout. He's not calling us to blips. He's calling us to just this biblical path of what it means to be generous. And so how can this be a way of life is really the question of what we want to talk about here. How can we go this way and not get burned out? Well, one thing we do want to spend a little bit of time talking about, and you'll have time in your MCs as well, is to talk about expectations. If we're talking about generosity, how do we know how much to give of ourselves? And we're talking about relationships here. We're not talking about money or any of that kind of stuff. To be relationally generous, it requires a lot of us. How much are we expected to give? And surely all of us probably have fears about giving too much and then not having enough time for ourselves. And therefore, we're going to maybe stay away from that and then not give it all. Often our expectations will dictate our actions. Pete Scazzero, who wrote numerous books under emotionally healthy spirituality kind of themes, wrote a book called Emotionally Healthy Relationships, and he has these kind of 4 primary ways of how expectations go wrong. So I'll talk about how they go wrong. Liz will talk about how they can go right. About wrong expectations, Scazzero says if you have a wrong expectation first, your expectation is unconscious. It's not something you even realized you were expecting someone to meet, and they didn't meet it. You didn't even know you had an expectation until it was either not met or it was violated in some way. And that other person definitely didn't know what was going on. So for us to have wrong expectations first, we have to be a little bit honest with ourselves. What am I expecting from others here? The second one is to have unrealistic expectations. That whatever it is that you expect another person to do for you is not reasonable considering who they are and who God's made them to be. Or maybe not reasonable given the circumstance that they're in or that you're in. The third way that expectations can go wrong is if they're unspoken. You just assume, now maybe you know what your expectation is, and maybe it's reasonable, but you assume the other person knows it just because you happen to know it. That means you didn't clearly articulate your expectation to another person. Now that doesn't mean you have to have a conversation like, I expect this for you to do this, and it's kind of a weird kind of conversation, but you can talk about, hey, when I'm here, can you do this for me? I mean, that's a very kind of simple way of putting it. The last one is to, okay, maybe you're conscious about your expectations, maybe they're reasonable, and maybe even you said them. Another way they can go wrong is if they're not agreed upon. The other person hears it, but doesn't say, yeah, I can do that, I can be that for you, or I can follow through in that way, but they just hear it. The person never really agreed to come through with your expectation. So if we have unconscious, unrealistic, unspoken, unagreed upon expectations, we should assume our relationships are going to go wrong. Because that means our expectations will be violated, we'll be let down, we'll let down other people. Now this shows up in almost every single area of our lives, beyond the church relationships that we have. It affects our friendships. Right? We can get angry when others don't show the same kind of interest, or maybe they're not as vulnerable as we are, or things like that. Those are expectations. It can affect our romantic relationships, whether you're married or not. We can become defensive, or we can become possessive, needy with our demands. It affects our parents if we have kids. We can live from the past of how we lived and how we were as kids. It can change our vision or desires, whether we have kids or not. Understanding where the pressure is coming from, all those kinds of things. It affects our work. We can put too much weight on our position at work, or our employer, or our employees if we have them. It affects our faith, of course, and that's a lot of what we're talking about here, because we can project onto God and His family all the needs that we have and all the ways that our world is broken, and expect in an kind of spoken ways, expect there to come through for us. And you know what? God's family is broken because guess who's part of it? You're part of it, I'm part of it, and it's just never always going to be perfect. It also affects our church experience. We can come to church with these unspoken needs, these unrealized kind of expectations, and then we can assume when those expectations are not met, we assume the problem is everybody else. So those are kind of some ways of how it can go wrong.
Yeah. So that's what not to do. What does it look like to have actual healthy relationships then? Well, Scazzero, is that how we say it?
Scazzero, yeah.
Scazzero writes about healthy expectations. So the first thing is that we are conscious of our expectations. So being able to say, I am aware of what I am expecting. I'm in touch with my real need, not just what I'm saying I want or think that I want, but actually that real need. And if we're not there yet, we can ask ourselves questions. Okay, what is it that I'm deeply wanting or needing right now? What am I expecting of this situation or this person? We want our expectations to be realistic. So this means that there's evidence to support that this is a good thing, that it's a reasonable thing, either that someone else, in the past, or another person has capacity and willingness to do this. It can also, we've got to be realistic with, is this a good amount of time that I'm expecting? Is there an element of the circumstances or the season that we're in that this is going to be a good thing? This is a reasonable expectation. Say coming up to Christmas, just before Christmas, I have very little expectation of my capacity because it's just so full, and I have that expectation of other people. It's a busy season, so it's unrealistic to say I think someone's going to be able to give me 5 hours of their time every week. So we've got to be realistic with our expectations. We've also got to speak our expectations, thinking, have I expressed my expectations clearly in such a way that they can be heard and understood? Not, oh yeah, I sort of said it, or it was kind of subtle, but they should have got the point. No, we need to be really clear. We need to be certain that we have communicated our expectations. But actually, this last one is agreed upon expectations. We haven't just communicated really clearly to someone and say, I expect you to do this. You have no say in it. Actually, it's something that needs to be agreed upon, that both people can say, yes, that is an expectation that I am willing to meet, or at least I will try and meet. And we've got to be gracious if people aren't able to live up to that. That we've got to have a shared framework in how we have those relationships, and we need to be able to provide a space where not only we can share, but other people can share back, and we can agree and feel like we have a say in what they're expecting of us.
Yeah, for sure. And sometimes I think a reason why we may not be so specific with these things is we can feel like maybe this is not kindness. Maybe if I'm very specific on what I expect from somebody, maybe that seems a bit like maybe business-like and not really kind. But actually, the more clarity we have, really, clarity is kindness. It's a form of kindness. If you're familiar with Brené Brown, she wrote a few books, but one of her first kind of famous book was a book called Dare to Lead. She writes a lot about kindness and the clarity that we have. It's kind of very biblical stuff. I'm just going to share 3 quotes from this book. It says, feeding people half-truths to make them feel better. Church, that's a very churchy thing to do, which is almost always about making ourselves feel more comfortable. Doing that is unkind. That's right. You're not really living in truth, and you're not really being honest with that person in front of you. So how can you possibly work for their good if you're not really going to be kind with them? Another quote, talking about people rather than to them is unkind. And we know that no one likes that, but yet we all kind of, we're tempted to do that, aren't we? This last quote, not getting clear with someone about expectations because it feels too hard. All of us, nobody really probably thinks it's very easy to do, but not doing this because it feels too hard, yet holding them accountable or blaming them for not delivering, that's unkind. All of that is unkind. In the generous act of being clear in our expectations, we're creating a place where other people can thrive. And this is actually how we can work for others' good, even in our own needs. Sometimes we think that if we have needs, someone has to work for our good. And yet that's probably true. But also if we have needs and we're clear in the expectations for them and in the kind of ways we talked about, that is a way to work for someone else's good, even as we present our needs. So we can always be working for someone else's good. And it's generous to kind of live that. It's a generous way of living. This is a different kind of generosity. Sometimes if we hear generosity, we just think about money, or maybe time, and we should be generous in those too. But this is relational generosity, and this is, I think, a lot more difficult because it requires our lives. We said there's no generosity without sacrifice. What are we sacrificing when we're clear in our expectations? We're sacrificing our own comfort. We're not normally doing something like this. We're sacrificing potential fears, potential anxieties, in order for other people to be able to thrive. But when other people thrive, they do as well. And the great thing about that is it catches on. Other people will thrive if other people are thriving. And then it's a win-win-win-win-win-win-win situation of everybody gets to grow together. It's amazing. It's almost like God made it that way on purpose. But this only really happens if one is courageous enough to be generous to begin with. And so you're going to have a bit of an activity and conversation around in your missional community to talk about expectations and where they go right and where they go wrong and things like that. Hopefully, at the end of it, to add a little bit of clarity so we can be more clear and therefore generous and more loving and kind in our relationships that we have with each other. So thanks for joining us for this session, and we'll see you in the next one.